Hello everybody, today we'll be talking about the people and the field of developmental psychology. I do want to remind you that as we go through this class on Launchpad, you'll be completing this Developing Lives parenting simulation. So the simulation will ask you questions about your virtual baby and that your answers may impact the physical, cognitive, and socio-emotional development of your virtual child. So it's kind of a fun way to apply some of what we've learned and also integrate your own ideas and thoughts and perspectives and have a little bit of fun. But I do want you to know that your choices do impact the simulation to some extent, but the computer program also gives you some random situations to deal with that have nothing to do with your choices. So if your virtual baby is having a lot of problems, does not mean that that has anything necessarily to do with your parenting, that they throw some difficulties your way so that you just learn how to deal with them. Okay, so reasons to learn about child development. There are a number of reasons why this is a very important topic, and we'll go through a few of them. Child development research helps answer child rearing questions, the idea about parenting. So how do you help children who have anger issues? How do you help children control their anger? In the United States, research shows that most parents of kindergarten children reported spanking their children. However, research on child development provides effective alternatives in terms of offering sympathy to children with anger issues, facilitating timeouts, so using timeouts in an appropriate fashion, and finding positive alternatives to expressing anger. So this research can then help us with better child rearing practices that may be more effective than just what makes sense. A lot of times parents use their what makes sense, their intuition, basically, when issues come up. And so understanding and knowing about child development can help you use what we call empirically validated responses. So you know that they have been proven by research. It's important to learn about child psychology because child psychology can change social policy. So knowing about child development facilitates informed decisions about social policy questions that affect children. One aspect of this is research on children's responses to leading interview questions in the court system. So when children have to go to court, and I actually worked in a program called Kids in Court, where children who needed to go to court, we would explain to them, so maybe they were being in an abusive or neglectful home, something about parents divorcing, and they needed the child's testimony. And so for children who knew they were going to need to be in court, we would meet with them, usually in the evenings, explain the whole process, explain all the people in the court, what does the judge do, what does the bailiff do, etc. And as the program went on, we would actually go to the court at night after it was closed and show the children what a courtroom looks like. They'd get to sit in different seats and try to get more comfortable with this courtroom process. So this is quite a big issue for a number of children, right? You can imagine going to court and having to testify, particularly if it's about your parents, can be a really impactful developmental issue. But there is research on how to obtain the most accurate testimony from preschool children, right? You have a child go through all of this. You would like to get accurate testimony. And so research on eyewitness testimony has resulted in many judicial and police agencies revising their procedures for interviewing child witnesses. This is because of child development research. And just to give you an idea, there's 100,000 child testimonies each year. More than 40% of children in child sexual abuse trials are younger than 5 years old. So again, trying to get accurate, honest testimony is very important. Research shows that 3 to 5-year-olds give accurate testimony when not asked leading questions. So it's very important with children to not ask leading questions, because we find when an adult asks a leading question, children are more apt to kind of go with the leading question from an adult, right? They always, children look up to adults and tend to answer in the way they think adults would want them to. It's hard enough for adults to not get tricked up by lawyers and their leading questions, but certainly for 3 to 5-year-olds, we really need to avoid those types of questions in order to get honest testimony. Younger children are easily misled by leading and repetitious questioning, and thus give inaccurate testimony. So if they're constantly being asked questions and information is presented to them, their testimony becomes very kind of muddled up. Also, realistic props used in testimony do not improve accuracy. So particularly with abuse, there was the idea that we could use props, bring in a doll, kind of anatomically correct doll, and ask questions. Were you touched here or there? What happened? And they find that those props actually don't improve accuracy. So a way that our research can then help in our social policy, in this case in the court system. And then, of course, understanding human nature. That child development research provides important insights into some of the most interesting aspects of human nature. Recent research among children adopted from orphanages in Romania that were somewhat neglectful orphanages. Children weren't getting the emotional support, the attachment to adults that they needed, supports the principle that the timing of experience influences their effects. So the Romanian children's early experience of deprivation continued to influence their development. So even if they were brought to the United States, adopted by a family or person who wanted to, and who was there emotionally and there to give them the emotional support, physical support, all of the things that that child would need, these early experiences continued to negatively influence development. And with the negative effects depending on how long the child had been in that institution. So we learned from this research that very early experiences can have long-lasting results. And we saw these age-related changes across all areas of development for these children raised in these deprived environments. In terms of physical development, they were of lower weight. Intellectual development, lower levels of intellectual development, and in social development, they had atypical development accompanied by abnormal brain activity and lower levels of neural activity in the amygdala. And the amygdala is a part of the brain that's really important for emotions. So now that we know it's important to study child development, what is it? What is developmental psychology? So as a field or a subfield of psychology, developmental psychology is studying the lifespan from prenatal to death. So the whole entire lifespan. And developmentalists are researchers and practitioners who study the human lifespan. So this is the scientific study, as I said, of human growth throughout life, starting prenatally, child development. That's what we're going to be focusing on in this class. You can take a class on adult development, right? We continue to development in our 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, right? And then gerontology, this is the study of older age. And again, we develop, and by develop, we're not always growing and getting better. Sometimes, right, as we age, people may have memory problems or cognitive problems, or they may be doing just fine in certain areas. There may be a myth that, I don't know, older people are more lonely or more depressed, and we need research to help us understand whether or not that's in fact accurate. So, in terms of lifespan development and how we study lifespan development, it's important to understand that this is a multidisciplinary study. This is a multidisciplinary field. We need people who are studying neuroscience, how the brain develops, nurses, social policy experts, anthropology and cultural experts. Everyone's working together to understand human development, right? We focus on predictable developmental milestones. So there is a lot of research on when is it typical for children to start walking, when is it typical for children to start talking, when is it typical for children to go through puberty, what about memory loss as people get older. So looking at those predictable developmental milestones, but then incorporating individual differences, because there is a very, very wide range of normal. When do children start walking? Around, let's just say age 1, right? 12 months. But there are children who walk much earlier, and there are children who walk much later. And so we're interested in these individual differences, the variability around any of these predictable milestones. And in terms of individual differences in all aspects of the person. Why do people have different personalities, right? Why do people have different IQs? Why are there people who are more aggressive than others? These are questions of individual differences, and so developmental psychologists study that as well. And then we also explore the impact of normative and non-normative life transitions. So when we talk about normative transitions, these are transitions, and transitions can often be difficult for people to go through, even if they are completely normal, like the first time a child goes to school. That's a normative transition, at least in our Western United States culture. Most children go to school. But that is a transition of leaving home, of being away from your parents for the first time, right? Going to kindergarten. And so how do children deal with those normative transitions? Retirement, that's another normative transition. People retire from their jobs later in life. And how do people deal with that? What is the impact, the cognitive impact, the emotional impact, even the physical impact of retiring? And then when we talk about non-normative transitions, these are more atypical transitions, things like divorce. How does divorce impact children? The death of a child, the death of a parent. Again, we're looking for the impacts of these transitions on children in terms of child development. So when we talk about setting the context, we know that development is influenced by a broad, very broad number of influences. We're going to talk about 4 of them. There are many more than this, but to sort of set the stage here, we're going to talk about how cohort, socioeconomic status, culture and ethnicity, and gender affect development. So when we talk about cohort, that is the effect of being born at the time you were born. So people born around the same time as you, the same year as you, are your cohort, right? So if you're 20 years old, born in the year 2000, everyone who's born in around the year 2000 is part of your cohort. And your cohort experiences life in a very specific way in terms of what is going on in the environment, timing of different a natural disaster, a pandemic, something like that, affects this cohort in a specific way, compared to a cohort of people born in, let's say, 1950, right? That's a different cohort. These are individuals who are now 70 years old. And so each cohort experiences specific environmental influences at specific times that may impact development, right? If you were born in 2000, you've had all this technology from very early on in life. And that might affect the way that your brain develops. It might affect your social abilities. It might affect your physical development. Maybe your home, people from who are around 20 are at home on the internet more than being outside and playing and things like that, versus people who were born in 1950, right? They were probably around 50 years old when all of these things came to be. How does that affect their development at that particular age? Again, social, cognitive, emotional development. How about going through a pandemic, right? This is going to affect our development, and it's hitting different cohorts at different ages, whether you're going through this at 20 years old in college, whether you're going through this as an adult, maybe a parent of young children, that's where I am, maybe as a grandparent, right? Or as a very young child, right? Maybe a cohort of individuals who are 5 years old right now. How is this affecting their lives? So that is the idea of a cohort. So relating to the real world, again, we've talked about this, as opposed to residing in cyberspace. So depending on your cohort, is your cohort more affected by these online relationships? May there be a permanent change in how people relate to each other based on online kind of social networks and things like that? From living in an expanding economy, again, maybe people born in the 1950s, there was more of an expanding economy, more opportunities for economic growth, to more financial hardship. We had a recession in 2008. Again, we're at more of an uncertain economic time currently. And so how does that affect development, emotional, cognitive, stress, anxiety, all of those things? And as we said, living through the coronavirus pandemic, how might this change the current cohort of developing children? And how might this affect the current cohort of young adults? And again, we could think about different cohorts, adults and grandparents and things like that. And there are some shifting demographics that we're seeing that can have an impact on child development. So there's research going on in all of these topics, and we will cover them as we go through this class. An increasing life expectancy and lower infant mortality rate, leading to an increase of attachment to the baby because the baby is more likely to survive. And in more affluent nations, children no longer have to work. And so, again, not having to work and being able to go to school has a huge developmental impact. Not only are children no longer needing to work, and in these demographics, I'm really talking about Western developed countries like the United States. We will talk about different cultural impacts of how culture impacts development as we move through this class. But in this section, I'm really focusing on kind of our Western developed countries. And also as we go through the class, I'm going to use the word parent, but I'm using the word parent very broadly. Parent could be a biological parent, a non-biological parent, really anyone who is a caregiver. Could be a grandparent, could be a adoptive parent, really anybody who is a caregiver to a child. All right, so another shift in demographics is the escalation in education, meaning that it is more common for children to not only graduate high school, but then maybe go on to college and even perhaps to graduate school. And the longer somebody is in school, this leads to longer periods of childhood. Now, childhood is in quotes there, right? Because if you're in college, we certainly don't consider you a child. But oftentimes, college students are not completely independent. They may be relying on parents for financial help still. Maybe they're living at home. And so they haven't quite taken on the fully adult role of living independently, being financially relying on themselves and not anybody else. And so this leads to kind of a longer period of some aspect of childhood. We see decreasing family size, less people are having less children, and so that can lead to increased attention on the children that they do have. And a decline in traditional two-parent families. We'll talk quite a bit about that, and so more single parents or same-sex parents or grandparents doing parenting, and how does that affect child development? All right, impact of socioeconomic status on individuals and nations. Socioeconomic status impacts development even prenatally, okay? So even before the baby is born, there can be effects of the socioeconomic status of the country that the child is being born into and or the family. And so we can talk about developed world nations, which are defined by wealth, higher life expectancy, more technology, more access to education, more access to medical care, compared to developing world nations, which may not have access to clean water, not as consistent medical care, less education. And in these developing world nations, children are more at risk to different things that may impact their development, like malnutrition and disease, etc. So other impacts on development is the impact of culture and ethnicity. And we'll talk quite a bit about this throughout the class. One example of the impact of culture and ethnicity is whether you're born into a culture that has a priority on collectivism or individualism. Okay, and so collectivism, these are cultures where it is encouraged for individuals to conform to society, to do what is best for the group, to not express beliefs that go against the group. The group or family rights are more important than the rights of the individual. Fitting in, conformity is required, and it's important to work with others. Cooperating is the norm. Everyone relies on others for support. Okay, as opposed to a more individualistic culture, this is like the United States that promotes individual goals, initiative, achievement. Each person is encouraged to stand out, be unique, express themselves. Individual rights are most important. Rules attempt to ensure independence, choices, freedom of speech. You don't need to fit in or conform. And you're relying or being dependent on others is seen more as shameful. People are encouraged to do things on their own and rely on themselves. And so you can see that this very different type of society and priority for society can certainly affect development. Okay, as an example, with how we raise babies in our country, the United States, which is typically more individualistic, and again, we will talk about in this actually today, that there's quite a bit of variability within a culture. So even though I'm saying in the United States, right, there is a huge amount of variability of how people do things in the United States. But typically, as an individualistic country, babies are encouraged to explore, right, to start being independent right from the beginning. Babies are put on the floor. Parents do a lot of safety things in the house so the child doesn't hurt themselves. I remember doing this with my children. My husband was the, master of putting rubber all over any potential sharp corners. We put up baby gates, but the goal is you allow the child to explore and start to become independent, and you make the house safe for the child. As opposed to in more collectivist countries, that exploration at a very early age is not encouraged. Children are held, carried, given to another adult. They're not put down to explore, right? They're really actually meant to be part of the group and sitting there with the group doing whatever is going on at that time. And you can see how from a very early on this can affect development. What about impacts of gender? We'll talk about biology that drive some gender differences. There are some biological differences between males and females. Life expectancy, right? Females typically live longer than males. But gender and gender roles are also shaped by culture, by the culture's value. And we'll talk about that. So these are the things we've talked about in terms of context of development. Cohort, what group you're in, the age group with whom you travel through life. Socioeconomic status, a term to describe our education and income. Culture and ethnicity, right? Enduring behaviors, ideas, attitudes, traditions of a group of people transmitted from one generation to the next. And gender, whether someone identifies as male or female and how that impacts development. Some basic questions about child development. Although experts in child development may choose different questions as the most important, there's widespread agreement that these are 7 really important themes. How do nature and nurture together shape development? Nature being biology and nurture being the environment. And we're going to talk a lot about this. How do children shape their own development? This is the idea of the active child. I'm going to go through each of these on a separate slide in a second. In what ways is development continuous and in what ways is it discontinuous? This is the idea of continuity versus discontinuity. How does change occur? What are the mechanisms of change? How does the sociocultural context influence development? How do children become so different from one another, individual differences? And how can research promote children's well-being? So research on children's welfare. So we'll start with the idea of nature and nurture together shaping development. So nurture is the environment. Anything in the environment, this can be parenting, friends, peers, the school, the community, any environmental influence is the environment, or what we call nurture. Nature is really the individual's biology, the genome, their complete set of hereditary information, what you're born with, right, your genes. And all human characteristics really seem to be created through an interaction of genes and environment. So the question is, how does this interaction between nature and nurture shape development? When we think about your intelligence, your IQ score, well, what part of that are you born with? You're born with genes that make you smart. Or what part of that is the environment? How much your parents helped you with school, what school you went to. If your friends thought it was important to study, so you studied more, or they didn't think it was important to study, so you studied less, right? Did you have a place to do your homework? Was there enough room in your house that you could have a quiet place to study, or was that really not possible? And so this is the question you can ask that about. What about your sense of humor? How did that develop? What about your level of aggressiveness, assertiveness, etc.? So those are questions we ask in developmental psychology. How does nature and nurture interact to shape the development of the individual? There's a bidirectional interaction of nature and nurture. So these two things seem to kind of go back and forth and affect each other. One example of this is schizophrenia. Why do some individuals develop schizophrenia? And we have research from family studies and twin studies that show that approximately 50% of whether or not somebody develops schizophrenia is genetic, that you are born with a genetic predisposition, perhaps, for schizophrenia. But the other 50% of whether somebody develops schizophrenia is environmental, that not everyone who's born with this genetic predisposition will end up developing schizophrenia. In fact, about 50% do, and 50% don't, and that's must be due to the environment. It could be that there's a stressful environment, or an illness, or use of drugs, something that triggers those genes to then lead to the development of schizophrenia. And you can see that here in this chart, that identical twins, So if one identical twin is diagnosed with schizophrenia, the other identical twin has about a 50% chance of developing schizophrenia. This is called a twin study. And identical twins share 100% of their genes. That's how they're identical. And so if developing schizophrenia was 100% genetic, well, if one identical twin developed schizophrenia, the other identical twin would also develop schizophrenia. But that's not what we see. We see 50% concordance rate. 50% of the time, if one identical twin develops schizophrenia, the other twin does. So we know we can, based on this research, assume that 50% of developing schizophrenia is genetic, while 50% is environmental. And there's a lot of research about what are those environmental triggers that would lead someone to develop schizophrenia, and then what are the protective factors in the environment that would allow somebody who was born with that genetic predisposition to then not develop schizophrenia. And then you can see here that the less genes in common somebody shares with a person with schizophrenia, the lower their risk. And so this is a pattern that shows us that there is a genetic component to developing schizophrenia, but it's not 100% genetic. Also, we do adoption studies in developmental research. And what they find is that children who have the greatest risk of developing schizophrenia had a biological parent who was diagnosed with schizophrenia, so they have that biological risk, and a troubled home that they were adopted into. That's that environmental part. And so again, this gives us the idea of the interplay between nature and nurture. The active child. Children contribute to their own development from early in life, and their contributions increase as they get older. So development doesn't just happen to the child. The child is actively going out to learn things and to try different things, and that impacts development. 3 of the most important contributions during the children's first years are their attentional patterns. So children prefer things, particularly during infancy, that move and make sounds. So they pay attention to those things, and by paying attention, they learn. And they also pay particular attention to mothers' faces during infancy. Again, that leads potentially to attachment, to a close emotional bond with their mother or whoever their caregiver is. And that influences their development. Use of language. Children are internally motivated to learn and practice talking. From very early on, children start to make babbling sounds, cooing sounds, and then they start to learn words using self-speech, and they're constantly trying to learn language, which then impacts their development. And play. Children are intrinsically motivated to play. They play initially very simply with a block or a rattle or something like that, and then it moves into more fantasy play, playing dress up, playing school. All of this play is affecting learning and development. And then older children and adolescents affect and contribute to their development by choosing the environments they want to be in, right? Are they going to be in sports? Are they going to be in a musical class? Who their friends are, what their activities are, and those choices impact their development quite a bit. So the active child is the idea that we are all active in our own development. This is an interesting one, continuity and discontinuity. The idea is, how does development happen? Is it discontinuous? Oh my gosh, excuse me. Discontinuous. That changes with age include occasional very large shifts. like stairs, okay, like kind of the stair-step approach, that there is a qualitative difference at these different stages. So thinking of a caterpillar turning into a butterfly, there's some amount of time, this is age here, where the caterpillar is a caterpillar, and then you get a qualitative shift when that caterpillar turns into a chrysalis in the cocoon. And then there is another qualitative shift when that caterpillar becomes a butterfly. Or do you think of development as a more continuous process in which changes with age occur gradually in very small segments, like a small tree becoming a bigger tree over time, where you're not seeing these huge differences, but just slow, continuous growth? And there are people who think about development in both of these ways, and in fact, depending on how you look at things, you might see development through one lens as continuous and through another as discontinuous. So this is just physical growth. Here's age and height, and depending on how you look at height, changes whether you think this growth is continuous or discontinuous. So if you're just looking at increase in height, this is in centimeters, over age, it looks pretty continuous, right? That we just sort of grow little by little and get taller and taller until we reach our adult height. But if you look at height gain in centimeters a year, this looks more discontinuous, like we're in different stages, because when we're very young, you see this rapid kind of decrease in height gain, right? Infants gain very quickly. From birth till about a year old, they are gaining height quite dramatically, and then it sort of slows down till you get to 4, and there's kind of an evening off of height gain, right? And then, whoop, what happens here? You're like at another stage. This is the growth spurt that happens during puberty. All of a sudden, you're starting to gain height very dramatically again. And then it goes, it decreases again. So this looks more like distinct stages, discontinuous, whereas you look at height growth this way, it looks more continuous. So something interesting to think about as we go through the class. How does change occur? Well, there seems to be an interaction between the genes and the environment that determines what kind of change occurs and when the change occurs. As an example, Rothbard and colleagues examined effortful attention. And so effortful attention includes voluntary controls of one's emotions and thoughts, right? That you are in control of your emotions and thoughts, and allows you to inhibit your impulses, very throughout development, that eventually we learn to inhibit our drives and impulses. Like maybe you're sitting here listening to this lecture and just want to get up and say, please stop talking. This is so boring. I can't listen anymore. But you don't. You sit and you listen because you know you need to. So even though your impulse may be to, run around or not listen anymore, or turn it off and just go see a movie and not pay any more attention to this lecture, you know you need to in order to pass the class. And so you're here doing that. It's inhibiting impulses, controlling your emotions, right? Not just letting your emotions control you, and focusing your attention on what's important to focus on, right? There's so many things going on around you, wherever you happen to be, and small children are like, their attention is everywhere. You can't focus them, right? But being able to focus your attention on what's important is key to effortful attention. And we find that childhood development of connections between brain areas, the anterior cingulate and the limbic system, are mechanisms that underlie improvement of effortful attention. So we see brain changes. Specific genes influence production of neurotransmitters that are associated with effortful attention. So again, specific genes kind of turn on and when, and that allows for improvement of effortful attention over development. And that we also see the environment plays a role. Effortful attention training can actually change the way that the brain processes and the genes express themselves, and you see improved test performance. So it's, again, nature and nurture, biology and environment. Another study, Workin, Gomez, and others, thought about the changing role of sleep in promoting learning and generalizations. Yeah, they studied the active systems consolidation theory and found that there's two interconnected brain areas, the hippocampus, which is important for memory, and the cortex, that simultaneously code new information during learning, and that this interconnectedness particularly works during sleep. And so sleep is important for learning. Again, so how do these developmental changes occur? We need this research so that we understand how the biology works, how the environment works to lead to development. The sociocultural context that influences development, physical, social, cultural, economic, and historical circumstances all interact to constitute the sociocultural context of a child's life. So when we're talking about the sociocultural context, that really influences every aspect of children's development. And we're going to talk in a little bit about Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model, which basically suggests that the most important component of development involves the people with whom the child interact, and these can be parents, siblings, peers, teachers, other people in their kind of community, but that also institutions are influential and important in development. So the school that the child goes to, the town that you live in, all of that is interacting and leading to the ultimate development of the child. Less tangible sociocultural factors include so the historical era or your cohort, the economic structure of your culture. Are there opportunities for women to work in your culture or not? That's just an example. Cultural beliefs that impact development. For example, does your culture believe that child care outside of the home harm children, or is it okay for children? And cultural values. For example, should mothers work outside of the home if they want, or should they not? All of these sociocultural influences impact child development. Importantly, when we talk about cultural comparisons, we want to talk about between cultures and within cultures. So when we talk about between cultures or cross-cultural research, we're saying how is one culture different from another? So an example of this is sleeping arrangements. Most U.S. infants sleep alone. In fact, there's usually a nursery set up with a crib that's in another room separate from the parents. But most Mayan children sleep with their mothers until age 2 or 3 and stay in the same room as their mothers until age 4. Just a very different way of kind of cultural expectations or norms. So that would be between cultures. But we also have to talk about within cultures, meaning within one culture, there is a large amount of variability. We certainly can't say that all U.S. infants sleep alone, right? There's variability. And what about socioeconomic status? Socioeconomic status, as we've mentioned, is a measure of social class that's based on education and income. And so socioeconomic context exerts a large influence on children's lives. And what we can think about is within a culture, let's just say within the United States, there is a huge variation of socioeconomic status, from children living in extreme poverty to children living in extreme wealth. And so within a culture, there is a huge amount of variability, and we can study that as well. So we know that children who are growing up in poverty are more likely, and I'm going to say more likely, this is not a causal relationship. This is not an experiment where we can say this thing causes something else to happen, but children in poverty are more likely to have health issues, to have lower cognitive outcomes, potentially due to poor nutrition, are less likely to finish school, have a higher school dropout rate, have more teen pregnancies, have more delinquent behavior. Now, this is within a culture. So within our culture, within a culture in another country, there's quite a lot of variability. So we can look at cross-cultural differences, but we can also look at within cultural differences. And as we talk about things that may negatively impact development, we talk about those as risks to development. Socioeconomic status is one of those. And cumulative risk, that's the accumulation of disadvantages over the years of development. And they can be many different things. And we also study, so we do study risk, but there's a large group of kind of newer research studying resilience. That what is it that makes a child resilient or able to successfully overcome a lot of negative factors in their development? There are children who grow up in poverty, who have been neglected, who have gone to not the best schools, who may have friends who are not the best influence, and yet these children turn out just fine. And the question is, how is that? Why is that? What is the resilience factors there? One of the other big questions, how do children become so different from one another? Well, different children, even ones within the same family, often react to the same experience in very different ways. Here we've got, I don't know, we're playing in some kind of car, and we've got somebody who is either having a lot of fun, I think that's what that looks like to me, and someone who's not so sure, right? You think about if you have a sibling, two siblings with very different personalities. And so research by SCAR shows that factors related to differences in children are genetic differences. So that's the nature part, born with the genes that are different. Differences in treatment by parents and others. Parents may think they're treating their children the same, but very often treat them differently, maybe based on who's the older child and who's the younger child. If there's a boy versus a girl, if one child is more shy and by temperamentally, and one child is more outgoing. And so those ways that parents and others interact with children can lead to further changes in their development. Differences in reactions to similar experiences, and we see this, right? You put two children in the same situation. Let's think about going swimming when they're very young. One child might be so excited and jump into the pool very excitedly, and one child is screaming and crying and afraid of it. And then, of course, the children's own choices of environments as children, particularly as they get older, even siblings, they'll have different friends, they'll choose to be part of different activities, and those choices lead to further changes in their development and allows them to be different from one another. And what about research promoting children's well-being? Very important. I'm a researcher and have done research for many years. So research often leads to a wide variety of benefits in diagnosing children's problems and in helping them to overcome any difficulties. So this can be anger management programs that are developed to help children with anger management issues. We talked about how do we get more valid child eyewitness testimony? And then a lot of educational innovations. This is an example screenshot from Brainology, which is an educational program based on the findings of Carol Dweck, and we are going to talk about her. You'll get to watch a video of hers. And this software, like the research studies by Dweck, emphasizes that learning makes children smarter by building new connections. And you can see they're learning that your dendrites, you're creating new synapses every time you learn, every time you take on a challenge. And by Dweck's research about what she calls the growth mindset, the idea that challenges are good for your brain, that can end up affecting children in such a way that they are more apt to take on a challenge. And they're okay if they make a mistake, but they're more persistent in their effort, and then they will can be more successful over time. So that's really important research. She's actually one of my favorite child development researchers, and we will talk about her. All right, theories or lenses for looking at the lifespan. You may have talked about this in an intro to psych class, so we'll talk a little bit about it here. But theories are basically a perspective or a set of assumptions, a view, a paradigm, a way that you see the world. We all see the world in a little bit of a different way. And that's the idea of a psychological theory. This is a way that we attempt to explain behavior based on a particular set of assumptions or a perspective. And it allows us to predict behavior and gives us some ideas for interventions to improve behavior. And this is really a question that has been around for centuries. What causes certain behaviors, right? If you see a child having a temper tantrum in the grocery store, somebody might walk by that child and think, oh my goodness, what's wrong with that child? That's a very difficult child, and attribute it to maybe the child's biology, their genes, they're a difficult child. Or someone else might walk by and say, what's that child? What's wrong with the parents? Why aren't they helping that child? They must be really bad parents, right? Years ago, probably some people, even today, how did historically people explain bad behavior? Well, it was an evil spirit. There must be an evil spirit that's, in that child, and that's what's causing the child to misbehave. There are lots of different perspectives. And to give you an idea of a perspective, take a look at this picture for a second. Don't say anything. Well, you might be by yourself, so it doesn't matter. What do you see? Well, some of you might see a duck. And if you saw a duck, right, here's the beak, here's the back of the head, here's the eye. The duck is facing towards the left. And some of you might have seen a rabbit. The rabbit is facing to the right. And here's the little nose of the rabbit. Here's the eyes. Here's the ears. And the idea here on perspective is that we're all looking at the same picture. Some of us saw a duck. Some of us saw a bunny. And that's how psychologists often view behavior. We're looking at the same child. And some of us are going to see it in one perspective, some will see it in a different perspective. So really going back to nature-nurture in terms of perspectives. In terms of the biggest nurture theory, this is behaviorism. This is the idea that the environment controls development and behavior. Started with Watson and Skinner. They did research with rats using a Skinner box, which basically is a cage. And they were trying to teach a rat to press a lever. And what happened is when the rat pressed the lever, a food pellet came out. And so when you initially put this rat in the cage, it just walks around the cage, like doing his little rat things, whatever that is. And then maybe comes over here and accidentally, maybe his tail presses the lever, and a food pellet comes out. All right. Then he continues to just walk around the cage doing his rat thing, and then again, maybe accidentally hits the lever, and a food pellet comes out. And eventually the rat thinks, something's going on over here, and stays more in this corner of the cage, maybe feels around on the wall and hits the lever, and a food pellet comes out. And before long, you have a rat who has learned to press this lever and get food. And this rat will just sit here and press the lever. The idea here is that nurture, or the environment, is all important. That how did we teach that behavior? Because we set the environment up that way. And that general laws of learning can explain all of behavior. That's the behavioral approach. The behavioral approach includes operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is learning in which a voluntary response is strengthened or is more likely to occur, or weakened, meaning it's less likely to occur, depending on favorable or unfavorable consequences. This is a lot like parenting, right? If you're reinforced for certain behaviors, you're given a treat, you're given a sticker, you're given candy, you're given a hug from mom or dad, you're given a gold star at your school classroom, you're more likely to do that behavior. And if you're not reinforced, either it's ignored or you're given a negative consequence, you lose the privilege to use your cell phone or your video game system or something like that, then those behaviors are less likely to occur. So behaviorists simply see reinforcing the right thing would lead to positive development. And it's all about reinforcement. But humans, even children, think and reason for themselves, so it doesn't seem to be as easy as simple reinforcement to explain all of behavior. So taking a different perspective, let's explore cognitions or thoughts. This is cognitive behaviorism, or the social learning theory, and this is that individuals learn by modeling or imitating others. Albert Bandura was the kind of first proponent of this, that we model people who are nurturing or who are involved with us. That how do children learn? They learn by watching others. They imitate their parents, their siblings, their friends. We model those who we perceive as being like us. And research shows that about at age 2, gender identification and gender-specific behaviors develop, and that children are then more apt to model individuals they see as similar to them in terms of gender. And even to this day, I mean, you could think about it to yourself. If you go somewhere that you've never been before and you're not really sure what to do, well, how do you learn what to do? Kind of look around you and see what other people are doing, and you do that, right? This is the idea of cognitive behaviorism or social learning. We learn by modeling. An important aspect or important component of this theory is self-efficacy, the belief in your own personal competence. Self-efficacy is the idea that through your own efforts, you can be successful at a given task. Some people are high in self-efficacy. They believe that if they work hard, they'll be successful. And some people are lower in self-efficacy, that they feel as though they're not going to be successful no matter what they do. And as you might imagine, it's been found that a strong sense of self-efficacy is a really important factor in healthy child development. So our goal is to figure out how can we improve self-efficacy in children as they're developing. All right, attachment theory. This is John Bowlby, whose main focus was the attachment response. And we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about this. But Bowlby was an evolutionary psychologist who believed that the attachment response, or a strong emotional connection between an infant and a caregiver, the research started between an infant and a mother. So this strong emotional bond was important to promote the survival of our species, right? If you think about an infant, they can't do very much. So they really need to have an attachment, a strong bond to an adult who can take care of them, who can feed them, who can move them around, can change their diapers, right? That is a really important thing evolutionarily. And so and then we find that as the research continues, that early attachments and the way in which infants attach to their caregivers in either a positive way, and then there are some less optimal types of attachment that can affect development all the way on into adulthood. So these early attachments are very important to explaining social relationships as an individual gets older. Which brings us to the idea of evolutionary psychologists. Evolutionary psychologists focus on biological predispositions, nature, and the idea of inborn species-specific behaviors that influence human development. That our development is really related to our genetic roots and is really the idea of survival of the fittest, that we're born with certain genes, and those genes that help us survive throughout development are the ones that are then passed on, and we can explain development through this evolutionary perspective. Now, behavioral geneticists explore the biology of human differences. So they really focus on, behavioral geneticists focus on research strategies that aim to scientifically determine the role that genetics play in individual differences. And this was like our research study we talked about with schizophrenia and the development of that disorder, using twin studies, identical twins who share 100% of their genes, and fraternal twins who share 50% of their genes. We use adoption studies, so when you have a child who is adopted at birth, then we can say, well, is this child more similar to their biological family, or their biological parents who they haven't met because they were adopted away at infancy, or are they more similar to their adopted parents who they don't have any biological relationship to, but that was the environment they grew up in? And so by doing these studies, behavioral geneticists can determine which traits are more biologically based and which traits are more environmentally or nature-based. And then twin adoption studies, this is rare, more rare, when you have twins that are adopted into two separate families, identical twins adopted apart, and you can really look at the similarities or the differences that you see. And in fact, we see some pretty amazing similarities when you have identical twins who are adopted into two different families, which really shows how many traits, even more than we would think about, may be biologically based. And so behavioral geneticists then sum up heritability, which is the extent to which a given behavior is shaped by genetics, which ranges from 1, which is totally genetics, like maybe your eye color, or 0, having no genetic contribution at all. So evolutionary psychology looks to nature or inborn biological genes that have evolved to promote survival and explain how we develop and behave based on these genetic kind of survival of the fittest traits. Whereas behavioral geneticists use specific research strategies like those adoption studies, twin studies, to examine the genetic contribution to the differences we see between human beings. Why does someone have higher IQ than someone else? Well, how much of IQ is actually biologically based and how much is environmentally based? So we really believe that, and research shows, that nature interacts with nurture when studying human development. And that we have these evocative forces, these are inborn talents and temperamental tendencies that naturally evoke certain responses from others. This is our genes, our inborn temperament, and then our active active forces that we actively select our environment based on our genetic tendencies, right? And so maybe you are particularly musical. Here we are looking at this picture, like music as a child, maybe you're soothed by music, and then that will naturally evoke certain responses from others, like perhaps caregiver, parent looking for music classes for you. And then active forces that you then start to select, oh, I'd like to take a music class, or can we get a piano? Can I watch or start watching YouTube videos on how to play music? And so these things work together. And this really leads to this very important concept of the person-environment fit. So the person-environment fit is the extent to which the environment is tailored to someone's biological tendencies and talents. The basic goal of developmental science is to foster the correct person-environment fit. The most crucial impact of the nature revolution is to allow for intervention to change the environment in order to enhance one's quality of life. So now that we know that there is some nature involved in who we are as people, there's some biology involved, then the idea is, how can we set up the environment, the home, the school, the parent, to best allow the child to fulfill their nature, their biological predisposition. And you could see sort of this goodness of fit model. Imagine you have a child who is born, who is very, very extroverted, likes to go out, likes to see people, an infant who's just happy being around others. And let's say the family, the parents are also very extroverted. And so the child likes to be around people, the parents like to be around people, so the parents, and again I'm using parents in the broadest sense of the word, take the child to play groups and to the park and to family functioning, and the child is so happy because the child's seeing lots of other people and being with other people and very happy in those situations, which then makes the parent very happy because they're saying, oh, look at my adorable, well-behaved child here. And then they go out and do more things together, and this is a great fit. But what if that very extroverted parent has a very introverted child? The child was born with genes to be shy, to want to stay home, to really like quiet places. And so that extroverted parent takes the introverted child out to play dates and, baby gymnastics classes and over to family members' houses where it's loud and noisy, and the child is unhappy, is crying, is complaining, right? And then the parent gets annoyed because the child isn't acting the way that he or she would hope. Maybe the child is angry, and then that can become a very bad fit, right? And so the idea is that we need to take the nature, right? We have our nature or our genetic tendencies that shapes our nurture, our life experiences, but we need the right nurture, we need the right environment to fully express our nature, right? This is the idea of goodness of fit. I did want to mention one age-linked theory here, Piaget's cognitive developmental theory. So instead of seeing things through that lens of, is it nature, is it nurture, is it evolution, what about changes over age? That there are developmentalists who believe that children change. Well, we know children change as they age, but that can explain changes in development. And one of the famous age-linked theories is Piaget's cognitive development theory. And that children hit different stages, so this is the idea of discontinuity, in their way of thinking. That different age groups actually think about the world in completely different ways. And that this is the way that Piaget sees the world, through children developed through stages as they reach different ages. And this is really a biological approach, more nature, that children can only really understand the world to a certain level based on their age and based on their brain development at that point. And then as their brain develops and they reach another age, they get to another cognitive stage. And so he's got, and we'll talk about some of this, different stages at different ages, that at every stage human beings share a hunger to learn and mentally grow, and every stage of cognitive growth is qualitatively different. You don't have to worry about this right now, but we'll talk about them as we go through the class. Piaget says learning occurs based on this process of what's called assimilation and accommodation. So we all have schemas or cognitive structures, which is your mental representation of something. And even when we're very young, we have these cognitive schemas in Piaget's perspective. And the process of assimilation is adding more and more information to your schema that makes sense to you. And then accommodation is changing your schema based on new information. So for example, when a child is learning what is a dog, so they start with a schema or a cognitive structure that a dog is something furry with 4 legs. Maybe they grow up and have a dog in the house and they know that this dog is furry and has 4 legs and we call it a dog. And the process of assimilation is when the child sees someone else's dog. They see a poodle and says, dog. And the parent says, yep, that's a dog. And then maybe they're on a walk and they see a husky and they say dog. They see a chihuahua and says dog, sees a Labrador and says dog. They're assimilating more and more information into the cognitive schema. And then accommodation is the process by which you have to change your schema. So then, let's say at night, the family goes out and the child sees a raccoon and says dog. A parent says, nope, that's a raccoon. Now the child needs to accommodate or change her schema for dog, because now we know there are some furry animals with 4 legs that are raccoons. And so it's this process of assimilating new information into your schema and then accommodating or changing your schema when you get information that, new information that allows children to learn. And then we're heading back to this ecological model, the Bronfenbrenner approach, who was really the first to highlight that development really takes place multi-level, multi-directional forces, right? So we have the child who's impacted by the family, the classroom, the peer group, the religious class, and then the mass media, community, school system, etc. And then even larger than that, the cultural values, the economic patterns, social conditions, that all of this is interacting with the child, and the child is interacting in a bidirectional way with all of these systems, and that we really need to use many different approaches to fully understand development, and that we need to examine the interaction of all these processes. So by looking at that, you can see this is a very complex topic to understand. All right. We'll end by talking about some common strategies developmentalists use to measure specific variables or concepts. So we can use, these are different research methods. We can study naturalistic observation. This is observing behavior directly. So you can go out into the field. This would be field research. Go to a park and observe children, and you're looking for something. Maybe you're looking for positive interactions between a child and an adult at the park, and you're coding and taking down how many times you see positive interactions between adults and children at a park. Or you can do this in your laboratory, maybe through a one-way mirror where you have a parent and a parent and a child in your laboratory, and again you're looking for certain behaviors and you're coding them and marking them down. Those are observational studies. There are self-report studies. These are questionnaires. You've all probably filled out a questionnaire before. So we have all sorts of questionnaires where we can ask children about, I don't know, their anxieties, their fears, what makes them angry, anger questionnaires, depression questionnaires, etc. And we get information through those questionnaires. And then observer reports, this is when, particularly when we're talking about child development, we ask a knowledgeable person like a parent, teacher, or a trained observer to complete questionnaires that are evaluating the person. So we might ask the child about his or her behavior, but then we often would ask the parent also about the child's behavior, because children aren't always the best reporters of their own behaviors. And if sometimes we get similar responses between the child and the observer, and sometimes we get opposite responses, and we've got to kind of figure out what that means. So we have two standard research strategies. We can do a correlational research study or an experimental study. When we're doing developmental research, correlational research studies examine relationships between dimensions of development that occur naturally. The key here is you're looking at things that happen naturally. You're not doing an experiment where you're manipulating something or where you're giving somebody a treatment. You're just looking at two things that occur naturally. For instance, you might ask in a school, you might ask children, do you get tutoring after school, and what's your GPA? Do you get tutoring after school, and what's your GPA? So we're just asking about two things that are naturally going on, whether or not a child gets tutoring and their GPA, right? Because we want to see, is there a relationship between these two things? Now, we could find something like this. Children who get tutored get worse grades than children who don't get tutored. This would be our correlational research. And what we have to remember with correlational research is that correlation doesn't equal causation. This is not to say that that getting tutored causes children to get lower grades. In fact, what does this probably mean? It probably means that the children who are having lower grades because they're struggling more at school are the ones who are getting tutored, right? But we can't really say anything about cause and effect when we look at correlational research, but we just ask people. Maybe we're interested in aggression and playing violent video games, and we would just ask parents, how many hours of violent video games does your child play a day, and how aggressive are they? And we're looking for a relationship or a relationship or a correlation between these two variables. But when we do a correlation, we cannot say anything about cause and effect. That's a key. When we do an experimental study, this is when we actually can change a variable, and we can say something about cause and effect relationships. And so in this case, we have a group of participants. We randomly assign participants to different groups. There's usually an experimental group and a control group. And then we compare the groups on the outcome variables. So, for instance, if we take a group of participants, everybody at a school, and we randomly assign them, one group gets tutoring after school and one group doesn't, and then we look at their GPA after a semester of tutoring. Now, if we see that those who got the tutoring have a lower GPA, we would say, wow, getting tutoring lowers your GPA for some reason. But we would probably find that those who got tutoring ended up with a higher GPA. And we could say that having tutoring increases your GPA, right? Or we could take a group of participants and assign one group to play violent video games 4 hours a day, and one group to play educational video games 4 hours a day. Now, we could talk about the ethics involved in this study. I don't think that's a very ethical study. I'm not sure how many people would allow their child to do that, but nonetheless, let's say we did. And then we look at how aggressive those children are. And if we found that the group of children who played the 4 hours of violent video games was more aggressive than the other group, then we would be more apt to say that playing violent video games can cause increases in aggression. There is more to designing a good experiment than what I've talked about here. Hopefully you'll all take a research methods class or have taken a research methods class, so you know there's more to it than this, but this is the general idea. Research designs that are unique to the study of development. We have longitudinal designs, and this is when we observe or test one group of individuals at several time points. Longitudinal studies are expensive because you're following children, the same children, over time, but allows us to examine whether something is continuous or discontinuous because you're looking at the same people across time. Whereas cross-sectional studies, this is when you observe or test groups of different ages at the same time period. This is more time effective and less expensive, but you can't really address continuity because you have different individuals at each age group. So this is just to sort of explain the same thing, right? If you're interested in, let's say, memory of 20-year-olds, 50-year-olds, and 80-year-olds, if you do a cross-sectional study, it means right now, today, I could find 20 20-year-olds, I could find 20 50-year-olds, and I could find 20 80-year-olds. I could give them all a memory test, and I could have a result that maybe 20-year-olds have better memory, 50-year-olds have a little bit worse, and 80-year-olds are even lower in memory. This tells me something about these groups, but the problem is we have different people in each group. And we actually have that cohort problem, that why are 20-year-olds doing better in memory than 80-year-olds? Is it because of age? Well, that's one explanation. It could be because of age. But could it also be because maybe 20-year-olds were born into this technology generation, and 20-year-olds have been using technology and multitasking and learning so much and learning so quickly that their memory is just better. Their brain is developing more synapses than these 80-year-olds. That it's not because they're 80 years old that their memory is lower, but it's because they grew up without all this technology, and they don't have all of those connections or synapses. They never did. That their memory would have been the same level even when they were 20 years old. You can't answer that question with a cross-sectional study. However, it's very quick. We can do it in one day. It's relatively inexpensive, and you can get some information from it. Now, a longitudinal study, this is where you study the same group of people at different time points. So you get a bunch of people right now who are 20 years old, you give them a memory test. Then you find the same people again 30 years later when they're 50, give them the same memory test. And then you find the same people again 30 years later when they're 80, and you give them the same memory test. And now, if you see that they do worse at age 80 than they did at age 20, you can say that age causes this decrease in in memory, because you're looking at the same people. But you can see what the problem is, particularly because this is a very extreme example. How long would it take for me to do this study? 60 years, right? I could start the study, and then I'd probably have to will it to my children for them to finish the study. So it can take a very long time. It can be very expensive. It can be very hard to do a longitudinal study. Now, in my research, I study children with neurological diagnoses like stroke, or children who have had stroke, or children diagnosed with autism, and we do longitudinal research, but certainly not for 60 years. We usually test them once a year for 5 years. to try to see how certain things develop. And that's hard enough. It's hard to keep track of people over 5 years, etc. But those are the two types of studies. And then when you're doing research, we can do quantitative or qualitative research. Quantitative, this is the typical type of research in developmental science using groups, and you turn whatever it is you're looking for into a number. So you turn your observations into numbers. How depressed are you on a scale of 1 to 10? And then you can start to do statistics, because you can find means and standard deviations and do different types of statistics. So that's when you quantitative, take your data and turn it into a number form. Qualitative research, this is where scientists aren't really interested in making numerical comparisons, but really they study a single person through detailed observation and interviews. And then when they do this type of research, it's basically like writing up the person's life history, call it kind of a case study, where you write about all of their childhood experiences and what's going on at school, and you're trying to learn about them in a qualitative way, not by just taking whatever information you're interested in, turning it into a number, and doing a statistical test. But this is a little bit less common. We typically use the quantitative approach. All right. Thank you very much, everybody.